10 mysterious trips into the wilderness that went horribly wrong. For many people, the wilderness represents paradise since it provides an opportunity to get away from the rigors of everyday life and experience nature. This is why millions of people take trips into the wilderness every year in order to participate in activities such as hiking, hunting, and camping. However, the wilderness can also be a very creepy and ominous place. If something goes horribly wrong, you are a long way from civilization and it may be impossible to seek help. It's very easy for a person to disappear into the wilderness and never be seen again. In most cases, the likely explanation is that they simply got lost and succumbed to the elements. But some trips into the wilderness are shrouded in mystery. 1. The disappearance of Keith Reinhardt. Peering up at the unforgiving mountains enveloping the old Colorado mining town of Silver Plume, it's easy to comprehend how Daily Herald sports writer Keith Reinhardt could have disappeared in those rocks without a trace in 1988. Gosh, look at that mountain, how can you find somebody up there, says town clerk Jody Canlin, 43, who grew up in Silver Plume and is raising her kids here, just as her parents, grandparents, great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents did. It's so steep and there's just so much of it, says Karen Mayhew, the substitute postmistress who moved here with her husband, a retired judge. It's really rough terrain. The town with its handful of dirt streets boasts as many as 200 residents in the summer. When Reinhardt said he was going for a hike, never came back and eventually was declared dead. But the population drops to 100 during the winter, when the only business open during daylight most days is the post office. Daylight is a precious commodity here in the winter, when the sun's low path across the sky keeps it perpetually hidden below the mountain ridge. For some of the residents, they know which day is the last for the sun and which day it's coming back, notes Mayhew. The KP Cafe, owned by Ted Parker, Reinhardt's longtime friend, closed a few days after December's big winter solstice celebration and won't reopen until June. On Friday nights in the summer, the cafe becomes an impromptu community center. People will bring their fiddles, guitars, and harmonicas, whatever they can play. There are a lot of good musicians in town, Mayhew says, adding, that's where stories get told. Reinhardt's story goes like this. About to turn 50, the colorful sports writer with a wild mane of gray hair took a 90-day leave of absence from the newspaper business and moved to Silver Plume to write. One August afternoon, he told people he was going to hike up to Sunrise Peak. When he never came back, a massive search party went looking. A rescue plane crashed, killing one of the volunteers, and the search was called off without finding a clue. But the mystery won't die. We think he's in Mexico, grumbles the town's burly, bearded maintenance man, who joins the post office chat but doesn't want to be quoted by name. His little escapade killed a man. Silver Plume sits alongside I-70. And the idea that Reinhardt faked his disappearance and hitchhiked out of the town has legs among some locals. I think he's alive and well, admits Gary Register, a photographer who has lived in town since 1977, and remembers telling Reinhardt not to attempt a hike so late in the day. Register knows the mountain and the town. So does his black, mixed chow dog Zippo, who pads down the snow-packed, deserted sidewalk ahead of Register, opens the door to the post office with her paw and pushes her way inside so her master can retrieve photography equipment shipped from Hong Kong. The mountain Reinhardt told people he was going to climb is dark, wet and foreboding even in the summer, says Register. There's many places, if you are at all disoriented, you drop 40 feet, Register says. But he explains that he's grown more and more skeptical of the official story as 2 decades have passed without anyone finding evidence that Reinhardt was on that mountain. I walk the ridge and cut down every once in a while, thinking, what if I find him? Register says. Rumors that Reinhardt is alive clearly irk Parker, who spends his winters in warmer climes. He was always devoted to his kids, Parker says, confident that Reinhardt, who would now be 71, wouldn't duck out on him or his future grandchildren, including one named Keith. If he were alive, Reinhardt would have come forward or even been forced out of hiding after his story ran on TV's Unsolved Mysteries, says Parker, who has no doubt that Reinhardt's body is still in those mountains. I spent a lot of time up there after it all happened, Parker says. It's 13,000 feet. It doesn't look as rugged as it is, but you'll kick a stone and you'll hear it hit a tree and then 5 seconds later, you'll hear it again. It's pretty awful. While Parker speculates that Reinhardt fell to his death as the sun disappeared on a moonless night, the mountain holds other dangers. A bridge is named after an 18-year-old student who was jogging behind the local high school when he disappeared. Searchers found what was left of his body 2 days later and shot the nearby mountain lion that had remnants of the teen's heart in its stomach. In his last letter to his boss and friend Bob Frisk, the Daily Herald sports editor in 1988, Reinhardt wrote, "I love these mountains and want to live in them before I die in them." Whatever happened to Keith Reinhardt, his story still lives in these mountains outside Silver Plume. 2. The Cline Falls State Park. Exman Terry Jentz was a young woman on a quest for adventure. In the summer of 1977, Jentz and a female companion started on a cross-country bike trip from the Willamette Valley in Oregon. At the time, both women were undergraduates at Yale University, and they'd planned to follow America's bicentennial bike trail, discovering the country and themselves along the way. "I really had no clue what America was about," Jentz said, "but what I do remember is what you hear from the rock songs of those times, you know, like the Eagles or Fleetwood Mac, go your own way. It was a sense that anything was possible and you just go out and make it happen." On June 22, 1977, after a long day biking into the high desert, the two women rolled into Cline Falls State Park, near Redmond, or they pitched their tent near a stream. But Jentz said something unnerved them. She called it a premonition. The women felt as if they were being watched. "It was an animal instinct of danger, and we both had it. We both had it separately and we shared it with one another," Jentz said. But the women stayed anyway, thinking they were just being paranoid. The women bedded down, but Jentz said she woke up suddenly about a half hour later. She said she realized there was a truck above her body, being murdered by a single psycho. "I first thought it was an accident, because it's preposterous to wake up under a truck, and I know there were kids cruising the park road, and I would assume they had been drinking, so what if somebody accidentally went off the curve and over our tent?" Jentz said. She expected to hear a lot of noise, maybe a group of drunken teenagers, but instead she heard what sounded like a single person get out of the truck. "And at that moment I hear my friend scream sharply, 'Leave us alone,' and then I hear a blow. Then I hear 6 more, just like that," Jentz said, clapping her hands. "Then," Jentz said, "she heard nothing, and then at that point I knew we were being murdered by a single psycho." After his attack on Jentz's companion, the stranger turned back to her. "He's above me. I'm thrashing from side to side. I catch a glimpse of a piece of wood, I feel a hunk of cold metal, and I then start losing consciousness," Jentz said. At that point, Jentz said, she knew she was dying, but then a voice inside her said, "I'm too young to die." She opened her eyes and she said standing over her was a meticulously dressed cowboy. Straddling me on each side I could see the boots, the pant legs, the shirt meticulously tucked in his pants, but his head disappeared in darkness. "But most horrifying," Jentz said, "I could see poised above me was an axe or a hatchet. I looked up at him and opened my eyes and I said, 'Take anything but leave us alone. Please leave us alone,'" she said. He brought the axe down slowly, and I caught it in my hands right above my heart, grabbed the blade in my hands. And then he withdrew it. The man stepped over her, got in his truck and squealed away," Jentz said. Rumor mill heats up. Despite broken bones and deep wounds to her head and arms, Jentz stumbled to the road and flagged down a pickup truck. Bill Penhallow and Buisak were teenagers driving through the park after a lover's quarrel when they saw Jentz emerge from the woods, covered in blood and screaming. "She was right there in the window, and she was messed up," said Isak. "You could see it by looking at her. She was so bloody it was dripping off her hair. The ends of her hair." Jentz flagged them down, screaming for help. She guided the young couple to the river, where her friend lay gravely wounded. That's when the three of them saw a pair of headlights sliced through the dark and a vehicle stopped nearby. That really got the adrenaline going because they shined their lights, turned around and then split and went up the hill, without coming through the park to see what was going on, which was unusual, Penhallow said. "And I assumed for sure it was the attacker." Jentz and her friend suffered severe wounds and were rushed to a nearby hospital. From the hospital windows, they could see the snow-capped volcanoes that bordered the small town of Redmond. Or, "This is God's country," Jentz said. "So I think there was a mentality that we are this nature-loving community. These things do not happen here. This is paradise." Within hours of the attack, Local police searched the crime scene, but aside from sketches made of the truck's tire tracks, the official investigation quickly ran cold. The rumor mill, however, heated up. Even an editorial in a local newspaper hinted that there were people in the town who knew more than they were saying. Rumors surfaced and stuff, Penlow said. They thought they had found some kind of a hatchet or something in the river with the initials on it. According to Penlow, those rumored initials were DD. But that rumor, along with reports that police were planning to question a local 17-year-old boy about the crime, all eventually led nowhere. I think people were assuming the police were taking care of it, Juntz said. I think the police were assuming that people would be calling in with tips if they knew them, and there was, you know, a massive disconnect. Recovered but not whole. In the years that followed, both women recovered, though Jentz's friend reportedly lost all memory of the attack due to the trauma. And Jentz found she was plagued by amorphous fears, earthquakes, random attacks, everything, she said. 15 years passed, and the crime at Cline Falls remained unsolved. Then in 1992, Jentz decided to pick up the trail herself. She returned to Redmond with a video camera and a notepad. She began to painstakingly comb police files and interview anyone who would talk. Jentz learned that the statute of limitations for the crime had run out in 1980, so legally speaking, the Axeman was untouchable. Jentz said she was angry the statute had run out, but said it also just fed her resolve to find her attacker. It turned out that less than 24 hours after Jentz and her companion were bludgeoned at Cline Falls, the Axeman may have struck again, not with a hatchet but with his bare hands. And this time the victim said she not only knew who did it, she'd gone to the prom with him. He could turn from this really nice, yes, ma'am, thank you, ma'am, to Satan in his eyes, said Jeannie Fish frailly. I mean, it was just like two different people, night and day, revisiting the past. Fraley's high school boyfriend was a boy named Dick Dam, who she says was physically and mentally abusive during their relationship. Over the course of 30 years, he compiled a long police record with convictions for carrying a dangerous weapon, violating a restraining order and driving under the influence. According to Fraley, Dam showed up drunk and angry at a nearby park. He hit me several times and got me on the ground, and he hit me and was hitting me in the face, kicked me, was spitting on me, Fraley said. Fraley said she managed to get away from him and dove into a nearby pond and swam away. She said she heard him say, "I'm going to kill you, BCH. Fraley escaped and reported the alleged attack to the police, but she said local law enforcement didn't pursue it. My parents, they tried to file charges against him with all of this, and they were told that since we were both minors to forget it, is what the judge told my dad," she said. But Fraley said she didn't forget it and remembered that a toolbox in Dam's pickup, where he always stored a hatchet, was missing. She said she realized something else was different about his truck. "I also noticed that he had changed the tires on the front of his pickup," she said. Fraley began to wonder if Dam and the Cline Falls attacker were one and the same. She said she visited the scene of the alleged attack and said she recognized the tire tracks from Dam's truck. "It was then," Fraley said, "she knew Dam was the Axeman. Without a shadow of a doubt I knew that," she said. But her certainty was apparently not shared by the police, who still had not produced a suspect, even though it seemed so many people in the town were convinced Dam was involved. Pat Daly has lived and worked just outside of Redmond all his life. Over the years, he said, he has hired Dam for various jobs and has known him ever since the first rumors began spreading about the attacks at Cline Falls. Daly said that Dam frequently brought up the attacks himself, saying that he knew everyone thought he did it. Dam has always denied involvement in the crime. In 1995, Daly arranged for Dam to meet him at a local restaurant. The meeting's real purpose was to let Jentz see Dam's face. Jentz's first reaction was that he looked mean, and he looked radiantly mean. Jentz said that Dam's outfit matched her memory of the stylishly dressed cowboy who attacked her, but she refused to confront him. "I don't want to give him the power to rationalize, deny, justify, say he's sorry for something I don't think he is sorry for," Jentz said. "It gives him power. That kind of confrontation is something you see in the movies, and it's not something that works for me in real life." Former State Trooper Marlon Hine had no such reservations. After reopening an investigation in 1995 into the Cline Falls case, Hine ordered 2 polygraphs for Dam, though the tests were technically labeled inconclusive because Dam reportedly had illegal drugs in his system. The official report on the second polygraph included this exchange. The examiner who conducted the test wrote, "It is this examiner's opinion that Mr. Dam is not being truthful in his responses to those relevant questions. Hein is convinced that the attacker was Dam, even though there is no physical evidence linking him to the crime. If I took all of the statements that I had, and all my reports, and was to take that to grand jury, I am confident that I would get an indictment," Hein said. "I feel that strongly about it." Last month Primetime requested an interview with Dam, who is currently being held at the Deschutes County Jail pending trial on multiple drug and assault charges. He declined. Jentz's difficult journey began nearly 30 years ago on a bike and now ends with a book, Strange Piece of Paradise, an account of her ordeal and her investigation into the case. With her life defined by fear for so long, Jentz said writing the book has helped her move forward. When a force out of nowhere comes and just takes your power away, something cuts you down, lays you low, ends your trip, almost ends your life. You're afraid of everything eventually, she said. And though she may never see anyone convicted of the crime against her, she stands by her convictions. I don't think there is any evidence out there that would ever prove me wrong. 3. The disappearance of Derrick Engelbertson. Derrick was looking for a Christmas tree in the Rocky Point area of Winnemucca National Forest in Klamath County, Oregon on December 5, 1998. He wandered away from his father and grandfather during the day and apparently became lost. Derrick has never been seen again. Extensive air and ground searches yielded few clues as to his whereabouts. A blizzard hit the area the evening he was reported missing, hampered search efforts and obliterated any tracks that might have been there. Volunteers discovered a candy wrapper and a Bonanza school bookmark near Rocky Point several days after Derrick disappeared. Blood of an unknown origin was also located at the scene. It is not known if the materials were connected to Derrick's case, but he had been enrolled at the school in 1998. A crude shelter made of fir boughs under several fallen logs are located on the mountain, but tracker dogs at the site did not seem to detect Derrick's scent. In the days following his disappearance, the temperature dipped below zero and there was a great deal of snow and wind. Police are of the opinion that Derrick could not have survived long on the mountain. They speculated he succumbed to the elements. Authorities investigated Derrick's case as a possible abduction shortly after he disappeared. An unidentified adult male was driving a black Honda in the Rocky Point area on December 5. A photo of a vehicle similar to the man's car is posted below this case summary. The individual reportedly asked for directions while in the forest. A witness allegedly saw an unidentified individual struggling with a young boy near the area later in the day. The witness did not stop because he assumed the man was the boy's father. Investigators do not know if the incident is related to Derrick's case. His father and grandfather have both taken polygraphs and are not considered suspects. In 1999, police discovered graffiti scrawled on the wall of a public restroom that they thought might have a connection to Derrick's disappearance. They never released the wording of the graffiti, but a portion of the wall was removed and sent to a state laboratory for analysis. Investigators eventually concluded that the writing was a cruel joke. In 2004, investigators announced that convicted child rapist Frank J. Milligan is the prime suspect in Derrick's disappearance. Milligan, a former aide in a children's psychiatric ward, is serving a 60-year prison sentence for kidnapping a 10-year-old boy in 2000, raping him, and slashing his throat. The child survived the attack. Milligan also was convicted of sexually abusing an 11-year-old boy. Authorities theorize that Derrick made it to the roadside on the day of his disappearance and was picked up by Milligan. An inmate of Milligan's told police and Derrick's family that he bragged about killing the missing boy while in prison. When authorities confronted him, he confessed to killing the child. He said he would plead guilty to the murder if he was spared the death penalty. He offered to lead investigators to his body, but a search turned up nothing and Milligan later recanted his confession. He has not been charged in connection with Derrick's case but is still considered a strong suspect. Derrick carried a small hatchet at the time of his disappearance. His father says he is accustomed to mountain terrain and routinely walked distances up to 20 miles through the southern Oregon countryside. Derrick enjoyed reading R.L. Stine's Goosebumps books series at the time he went missing. His case is unsolved. 4. The Falcon Lake UFO encounter. People who claimed to have seen UFOs do not typically return with any evidence to verify their stories, but in this instance, the person involved came back with more than a tall tale. The evidence of his encounter was actually burned into his body. Stephen Michalak and his wife came to Manitoba, Canada, from Poland. After World War II, Stephen found work as an industrial mechanic and was also an amateur rock hound. He spent every spare moment in the beautiful natural woodlands of Manitoba. I love nature. I love birds, animals. Every weekend I usually go out in the country and snooping in the rocks. On May 20, 1967, Stephen was prospecting in the hills east of Winnipeg, when he was suddenly distracted by a noisy flock of geese. Looking on the tree, I noticed two cigarette-like shaped things, with the hump in the middle. I said, "What the hell is that?" One in the air and the other one is coming down, down, down. I start looking for marks, NASA or something. Nothing. I didn't see anything on it. Stephen's son, Stan Michalak, was 10 years old at the time and recalled what his father witnessed. I do remember one description that he gave at the time. He said that the skin of the craft, the outside of the craft, was flawless. There was nothing. It was as though you had milled out of a solid block of steel. This disc, this saucer with the dome on top. Stephen told his son that, after a few moments, the door of the craft slowly opened. The light emitted from the door was so bright, he had to snap down the visor on his safety goggles. Then, after a few moments, the door suddenly shut. According to Stephen, the craft rotated counterclockwise, knocking him backwards, and setting his shirt on fire. After igniting with the fire, the craft lifts up 30 to 40 feet and vanishes. And then I decide, now is the time for me to buzz off from here, so I start going. In shock, Stephen headed back toward his car. He was nauseous and vomited several times. Disoriented, he checked his compass, trying to find his way southeast, to the road. But the needle went haywire. Stephen made his best guess at the right direction. 9 hours later, he finally arrived back home. He was badly burned and still disoriented. According to his son, Stan, Stephen's burns left doctors baffled. At that point in time, the diagnosis, if you can call it that, was burns. And sure, they were burns. Yes, he'd caused burns. What they couldn't diagnose and didn't have a clue about was what appeared below the chest on the abdomen. The exact same patterns of holes that was on the grid on the side of the craft, in the same order, in the same rows, in the same number, appeared as red spots on his lower abdomen, red dots. Stephen was released from the hospital, but his symptoms worsened. The nausea continued and his body seemed to emit a sulfuric stench. Stephen was tested for radiation poisoning, but the results were negative. No one could explain the source of the strange burns on his torso. 6 weeks after the encounter, Stephen and a friend went looking for the site. After several hours they found a burned-out circle the same size as the craft Stephen had seen. It was more than 30 feet across. Within days, a team of experts from the United States, working with the Royal Canadian Air Force, converged on the site. They took measurements, catalogued soil samples, and checked for radiation. The levels appeared quite high, and the health department considered quarantining the area. Later, however, they discovered that the high levels were caused by an unrelated vein of radium which ran under the entire region. Meanwhile, Stephen's burns, which had appeared to be healing, suddenly flared up again. According to Stephen, his doctors remained mystified. After every 3 months, my burns from legs and here were coming back, showing up again and burning. Nearly 30 years after his encounter, Stephen died with the burn marks still emblazoned on his torso. For the remainder of his life, Stephen Michalak never lost faith that on May 20, 1967, he had a remarkable encounter with something not of this earth. 5. The disappearances of David Till and Brian Ogden. Till left his residence in St. Clair Shores, Michigan on November 22, 1985. He was accompanied by his close childhood friend Brian Ogden. The two men planned to spend the weekend deer hunting in White Cloud in northern Michigan, at Till's family's cabin on Baseline Road. The last unconfirmed sighting of Ogden and Till took place in the Houghton Lake, Mayo area of Michigan on the day they vanished. They cashed a $50 check and left in Till's black 1980 Ford Bronco with the license plate number 447HRZ. They never arrived at the cabin or purchased hunting licenses. The Bronco they were driving has never been located. A photo of it is posted below this case summary. The two men were carrying $140 between them at the time of their disappearances. In May 2003, almost 18 years after Tills and Ogunjin's disappearances, two brothers were arrested in connection with their cases. Police believe Raymond Wilbur J.R. Duval Jr. and Donald Dean Coco Duval killed Ogunjin and Till on the night they disappeared. Before their arrest, the men led a rough existence living off the Michigan woods, shooting game and sleeping in small cabins and trailers. Photographs of the Duvals are posted below this case summary. Witnesses reported seeing the Duvals beat Ogunjin and Till to death outside the Linkers Lounge bar in Mayo, and other witnesses who heard the brothers brag about feeding the missing men's bodies to pigs. The informants allegedly did not come forward for so long because they had been threatened by the brothers and were afraid of retribution. Several of them have died since 1985. There is no blood or other physical evidence linking the Duvals to Tills and Ogunjin's presumed deaths, and their attorneys said they were being framed and the witnesses were all either lying or mistaken. The star prosecution witness admitted to having had 9 alcoholic drinks prior to witnessing Tills and Ogunjin's murders. Nevertheless, both defendants were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in October 2003. They were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Till was married and worked as a machinist for his father-in-law at the time of his disappearance. Foul play is suspected in his and Ogunjin's disappearances due to the circumstances involved. Their cases were the subject of a 2006 book, Darker Than Night, by Tom Henderson. 6. The disappearance of James Harrod. Nick Tosses spent years researching the 1920s. Musician Emmett Miller, who had been quite famous in his day yet left almost no trace of his existence just a half-century later. His quest to know more about the man became an obsession that spanned decades, and finally bore fruit, as detailed in his book Where Dead Voices Gather. Perhaps one day scholars will plumb the depths of the mysteries of Kentucky's James Harrod as well, but I wouldn't bet on it. Harrod is a key part of Kentucky history, yet one whose record is smudged in places and completely blank in others. We don't know when he was born and we don't know when he died. We have no photographs or paintings of his likeness. We know almost nothing about his early life. We do know he served in the French and Indian War, and was probably underage when he did so. We also know he was an important early settler of Kentucky, in every way a peer of Daniel Boone and George Rogers Clark, yet his name is not a household word. Well, then again, in a way it is for some. Harrod founded the first permanent settlement in Kentucky in 1774 and we know it today as the city pictured above, Harrodsburg. In February 1792, Harrod left on a hunting trip in the wilderness of Kentucky and was never seen again. There are as many theories and explanations for his vanishing as there are JFK conspiracy theories, and we'll probably never know the truth. Some say he was a bigamist and had another wife and family, to whom he returned to under another name, and was likely buried under this pseudonym. Others tell of a pair of woodsmen held captive by Indians in Michigan meeting a fellow prisoner referred to as Colonel Harrod. And yet another account has it that Harrod had been killed by one of his fellow hunters, a man named Bridges, and that the secret purpose of their hunting expedition was to search for Jonathan Swift's fabled silver mine. Supposedly this Bridges guy was caught selling silver buttons from Harrod's coat, conveniently engraved with the letter H, at a Lexington shop. Then there's the bizarre tale that some of Harrod's friends found his skeleton in a cave, wrapped in grass. However, some say the skeleton was wearing Harrod's shirt and some say it wasn't. Supposedly, Harrod's family believed the skeleton to be his, so the question then becomes, why didn't they bury the skeleton and give him a proper gravestone? And why then, when Anne applied for Harrod's pension, did she swear he had died in a hunting accident and that his clothes had been found in a nearby river but his body never found? The most logical explanation, to me, would be that he simply died in the woods and no one ever found his body, which probably was torn apart by wild animals. But according to the James Harrod Trust, in the 1880s, a rumor circulated that Bridges, who had returned to Virginia, confessed on his deathbed to the Harrod murder and revealed the place of his burial in what is now Austria County, Kentucky. Or maybe he encountered the devil deer. I'm not exactly weeping copious tears for Harrod, though. He actively opposed Daniel Boone and Richard Henderson's Transylvania Purchase, and aided and abetted the crooked land grab from Virginia. He went on to represent Virginia's Kentucky County in the Virginia House of Delegates. Many people, your humble author included, believe that most of the area should still be known as Transylvania because it was improperly wrested from Boone and Henderson's hands by the state of Virginia before regaining its independence. 7. The death of Philippe Hausmann's father. After leaving Europe and moving to the U.S. during the 1940s, Philippe Hausmann became one of the world's most renowned portrait photographers. However, before Hausmann's career even began, his life was almost derailed by a controversial murder case. On September 10, 1928, the 22-year-old Hausmann went on a hiking trip with his father, Mordechai Hausmann, in the Zillertal Valley in Tyrol, Austria. According to Hausmann, he was walking ahead of his father when he suddenly fell into a ravine. When Hausmann found his father's body near a riverbank, he was still alive, so Hausmann went off to get help. By the time he returned, his father was dead and his empty wallet was now resting beside him. A stone was found with Mordechai Hausmann's blood and hair on it, indicating that he was robbed and murdered sometime after his fall. Authorities soon made the shocking allegation that Philippe Hausmann was responsible and charged him with his father's murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, Hausmann had no discernible motive to kill his father and there was no evidence to implicate him. Since Hausmann was Jewish and Tyrol was known for being an anti-Semitic community at the time, this seemed to be the motivating factor behind his conviction. He had many notable supporters who believed in his innocence, including Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. The prosecution had presented Freud's Oedipus complex as a possible motive for Hausmann murdering his father, but Freud himself refuted this idea. Hausmann eventually garnered a new trial and received a lighter sentence of 4 years, but his supporters weren't satisfied. They successfully petitioned the President of Austria to grant Hausmann a full pardon, and he was released in October of 1930. The real murderer of Mordechai Hausmann was never found. 8. The disappearance of Jared Negrete. 3 weeks ago, Philippe Negrete chased a ghost up a mountain. It had been 10 years since his 12-year-old son, Jared, vanished high on Mount San Gorgonio and was never seen again. Negrete followed his son's path up the mountain, prayed, and then collapsed, clawing at the rocky trail. It was a difficult trip, but necessary. I felt my son near me, Philippe Negrete said. I felt closure, but that fragile peace has been shattered because another boy is lost in the same area on Southern California's highest peak. Suddenly, the Negretes are glued to their television set, awaiting word on 16-year-old William Parvin, as if he were their own son. Linda Negrete finds herself dusting off the piece of wood that Jared carved his name into, running her fingers over the crude letters. The Negretes gaze at Jared's portrait over the fireplace and wonder what he would look like today, what he would be doing if he were still alive. And they have stumbled into a tragic kinship with a set of parents they have never met. I just wish I could put my arms around that boy's mother, Linda Negrete said. 10 years ago, hundreds of rescuers searched for 19 days, before giving up hope of finding Jared Negrete. William Parvin has been missing for 4 days on the 11,499-foot mountain. The Negretes know it could be the beginning of a much longer ordeal for the boy's parents. I see the looks on their face, Linda Negrete said. It's desperation. It's horror. No one can comprehend it. But I know it. I feel it again, in an instant. In July 1991, Jared Negrete, a shy, pudgy, friendly boy from El Monte, went with his Boy Scout troop on his first overnight camping trip. The 14 boys and their leader began hiking at Camp Tahquitz, south of Big Bear Lake, and were en route to the summit of Mount San Gorgonio when Jared began lagging behind. At some point, he is believed to have strayed onto the wrong trail. Rescue teams from as far away as Malibu searched around the clock. They found shoe prints at about 10,000 feet matching those of Jared. They found his backpack. They found beef jerky and candy wrappers. They found his camera. They developed the film and found a haunting last picture Jared had taken of himself. His small arms could reach out only so far from his face, so the photo was an extreme close-up. They never found Jared. You could see in the photo that he was very scared, Philippe Negrete said. It is a beautiful place. God created it that way. But it is not a playground. It is a dangerous place. Mount San Gorgonio, in the southeastern part of the San Bernardino National Forest north of Beaumont and Banning, is the highest peak in California south of the Sierra Nevada. It is a breathtaking bramble of rocky crags, sandy switchbacks and dozens of trails, many of which meander to nowhere. Hikers frequently get lost in the area. Most either wander back to civilization or are found by search and rescue teams. Rarely do they vanish without a trace, said El Monte Police Chief Bill Ankeny, who was a captain on the force 10 years ago and helped organize the search for Jared. Ankeny remembers that there were many theories about what might have happened to Jared, that he had been attacked by a bear or a mountain lion, that he had wandered onto a road and was kidnapped. Those theories were discounted. Ankeny says his thoughts immediately returned to the frustrating search for Jared, when he heard Wednesday morning of William Parvin's disappearance. I remember it like it was yesterday, said Ankeny, who went to the mountain to help with the search. The parents were suffering, and we suffered right along with them. William Parvin, who is from the San Fernando Valley, was last seen Sunday afternoon. He had gone on ahead of his father and 12-year-old sister as they hiked toward the summit of San Gorgonio. At 16, William is 4 years older than Jared was. He is reportedly a far more experienced hiker and camper. No one has given up hope that he will be found alive. The Negretes heard about Parvin when their daughter, April, called Monday after hearing about it on the news. "There's another one," April told them. Up in the woods. Linda Negrete said she prays for William's safe return. If the worst happens, she says, she hopes that rescuers at least are able to recover the body. "That would be something," she said. "I have nothing. I don't even have a grave." Much has happened to the Negretes since Jared's highly publicized disappearance. They have moved from El Monte to Walnut, away from reminders of Jared. Along with their 2 biological children, they have adopted 2 more, a girl and a boy. "One does not take the place of another," Linda Negrete said, "but it sure helps." 9. The murders of Julian Marie Williams and Lorelei Winans. Wednesday marked 21 years since the unsolved killings of 2 women found at a campsite in the Shenandoah National Park, a case that also had suspected ties to other Fredericksburg area killings committed by a serial killer or killers. On Wednesday, the FBI sent out a news release, along with updated posters, asking for help solving the double homicide of Julian "Julie" Williams and Lorelei Winans. The National Park Service and the FBI have investigated this case for years, and it very much continues to be an active, ongoing investigation, the FBI said in the release. In a telephone interview with a freelance star on Wednesday, Tom Williams said he has learned to move on in the 2 decades since his daughter's death, but remembers his daughter daily. "Julie's with us every day," he said. "It's every day that you think of her." Williams, 24, of Street, Cloud, Minnesota, and Winans, 26, of Unity, Maine, had set out on a camping trip with their golden retriever, Taj, in May 1996. Tom Williams said the trip was a way for his daughter, a geology major in college, to enjoy some free time before starting a new job in Lake Champlain, VT. She was set to start the job on June 1, 1996. Instead, that was the day the lifeless bodies of Williams and Winans were found about a quarter-mile from Skyline Drive off the Appalachian Trail. The killer had stripped the women of their clothes, bound and gagged them, and slit their throats. Although the case remains unsolved, there was at least one strong suspect, Darrell David Rice. In July 1997, Rice, a Maryland resident at the time, was arrested after an attempted abduction of a female bicyclist in the Shenandoah Park. He eventually served a 10-year sentence for the abduction attempt. Investigators continued to investigate him in the double homicide, and in April 2002, Rice was indicted on capital murder charges in the Shenandoah Park killings, with authorities claiming he targeted Williams and Winans out of a hatred for women and homosexuals. But, because they lacked forensic evidence against Rice, federal prosecutors' case fell apart and the charges were dropped. A forensic test failed to rule out known serial killer Richard Markovitz, who killed 3 Fredericksburg area girls in 1996 and 1997, as the source of 2 key head hairs found at the park scene, according to a 2007 investigative report by the freelance star. Ivanitz killed himself in 2002, as police closed in on him. After the case fell apart, investigators tied Rice to the Route 29 stalker, who terrified the region in the early months of 1996 by tricking women into pulling over on the highway in an attempt to abduct them. In March of that year, Alicia Showalter Reynolds disappeared while traveling on Route 29 in Culper. Her remains were later found in a lignum field. In 2005, although he maintained his innocence, Rice pleaded no contest in an attempted abduction of a Northern Virginia woman that was considered to be tied to the stalker case. He was never charged in Showalter's death. That case, like the Shenandoah Park killings, remains unsolved. Tom Williams holds out hope that the person who killed Winans and his daughter will be caught. "I'm pretty much convinced that somebody likely does know something," he said. "For everybody's sake, it would be good to get this person off the streets." 10. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park disappearances. Just 6 days shy of 7 years old, Dennis Martin was a boy with curly brown hair and a happy smile. The red t-shirt tucked into his green hiking shorts made it easy for the grown-ups in his group to see him run along Spence Field in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. His dash from the bright sunlight into the dark brush on the afternoon of June 14, 1969, was the last time Dennis Lloyd Martin, Denny to his family and friends, was ever seen. People lost in the wilderness are not typical missing persons cases. Regardless of the age of the lost person, they prompt a quick search. The search for the Knoxville boy was the most massive in the park's history, but it was marked by errors and hampered by fog and flash floods. 40 years later, the child's fate remains one of Tennessee's greatest mysteries. The case still haunts Dwight McCarter, 64, of Townsend, a retired Park Service ranger who took part in the search. The Dennis Martin case takes up a good portion of Lost, his book about searches for lost campers and hikers. "Children are important to us," he says in his slow, deep mountain drawl. "They tug at our hearts." There are 3 main theories as to what happened to Dennis Martin. The first is that he simply got disoriented and perished in the rugged terrain. The other 2 are that he was attacked by a hungry bear, or taken by a human predator. But there is no mystery about the happy events before his disappearance. He was on his first overnight camping trip, part of the long Martin family tradition of Father's Day outings in the Smokies. With him were his 9-year-old brother Doug, his father, Knoxville architect Bill Martin, and his grandfather, Clyde Martin. The group spent the night in Russell Field with Dr. Carter Martin of Huntsville, Alabama, and his 2 sons. The next morning, June 14th, the group hiked to Spence Field, where several other Martin family members were gathered. Around 3 p.m., the grown-ups watched Dennis, Doug and Carter Martin's sons huddle up, look over at them, then split off. The grown-ups knew the children were planning to circle around and startle them, and readied themselves for the prank. Doug and the Alabama Martin kids went one way. Dennis went in another direction, alone. When the first 3 kids sprang, everyone thought Dennis was late, since he was smaller and had a longer route to make the circle. But less than 5 minutes passed before the adult men in the group split up and began a search. McCarter believes that what most likely happened to Dennis is that he got lost, became disoriented, and Dennis perished in the wild. But he does not rule out either of the other 2 theories. He cites several reasons why the massive search could have missed Dennis or his body. A 48-inch tall boy can easily elude detection in rugged mountain terrain, and especially in a rhododendron or laurel thicket. The sound of a roaring creek can prevent a searcher from hearing a child shouts for help, and in some cases, lost and disoriented children have been known to hide from searchers. As for an animal attack, McCarter said, that is possible. Bears normally will not attack humans, but in June 1969, their normal food sources were greatly diminished. And near Spence Field about 2 weeks before Dennis disappeared, McCarter said, rangers released a bony, scrawny bear caught in a wild boar trap baited with corn, something that bears normally do not eat. The Martin family declined to be interviewed for this story. They came to believe someone took Dennis, said McCarter, who stayed in touch with the Martins for several years. The afternoon that Dennis disappeared, Harold Key, 45, of Carthage, Tennessee, was near Rowan's Creek in the Sea Branch area with his family when he heard an enormous, sickening scream. A few minutes later, he noticed a rough-looking man moving stealthily in the woods near where he had heard the scream. I thought he might have been a moonshiner, Key later told News Sentinel writer Carson Brewer. Unaware of the search for a lost boy, Key did not report the incident until several days later, after he had returned home and learned of Dennis Martin, but Key did not recall the exact time this occurred, and part of the time frame he gave included a period that would have made a connection to Dennis Martin's disappearance impossible. Park officials also discounted the likelihood of a connection because of the distance from where Dennis was last seen, and the FBI concluded it did not have sufficient evidence to launch a complete investigation. As darkness fell on the first day of Dennis' disappearance, thunder and lightning filled the sky, and 2½ inches of rain fell. It rained again June 17th. Early in the second week of the search, nearly 3 inches fell. Each storm would have demolished any new tracks that Dennis might have left after the previous storm. The rain washed everything away, said McCarter. Volunteers helping park rangers in the search included college students, Boy Scouts, hunters, on- and off-duty firefighters and police, members of 57 rescue squads from 4 states, and military personnel, including 60 Green Berets diverted from a training mission. The thing that stood out to me was what a huge search it was, and the mystery of what happened to the boy, said Gerald Seagroves, who covered the story for the Associated Press. Now a retired News Sentinel copy editor, Seagroves told of searchers on their hands and knees, looking into brush for the boy. According to the park's final official report, the number of searchers rose steadily from a few hundred to a peak of 1,400 on June 21. After that, the numbers began dwindling, along with hope that Dennis could be found alive. By the time the search officially ended in September, the searchers had logged 13,420 man-hours. Helicopters spent nearly 200 hours in the air. All of that was too much of a good thing, states an internal Park Service memo written after the search. As the search began, everyone kept feeling that the boy would be found in the next hour, and it was probably this reason why the search organization did not keep pace with the rapid manpower buildup. Park Superintendent Keith Nielsen wrote, "This search developed so fast that we failed to realize the need for quick organization, from the standpoint of manpower, overhead and public relations. The large numbers of people would have overlapped or even obliterated new clues or signs of the missing boy. There were so many footprints, a mass confusion of footprints," McCarter said. Several days into the search, 2 men from Townsend noticed a shoe print near the west prong of the Pigeon River. It was the size of a child's Oxford-type shoe, which Dennis Martin was last seen wearing. McCarter said this lead was not fully followed up because searchers had already been in the area. McCarter was just 24 years old, and still learning from senior rangers and other mentors. Today, he says the 2 things he most wishes would have happened were massive searches of the area where that print was found and of the Sea Branch area where the scream was heard and the rough-looking man was seen. McCarter said Sea Branch is downhill of where Dennis was last seen, and it is possible for a physically fit man to carry a small boy between the 2 points. Perhaps more significantly, Dennis Martin could have reached that location alone. A few years after Dennis was last seen, a man came across the skeletal remains of a small child in Tremont's Big Hollow. The bones included the skull, and were already being scattered by animals. The man kept the find to himself for years because he had been illegally hunting ginseng and feared he would be prosecuted. In 1985, he contacted McCarter, who he knew personally, and told him about the skeleton. McCarter and 30 volunteer rescue squadsmen from Swain County, NC, searched the area but found nothing. By this time, animals would have had more than enough time to destroy the remains. The area is about 3 to 3½ miles downhill from where Dennis was last seen and in the same direction as the Oxford shoe print found by the West Prong. McCarter said, "It is about 9 miles from where the scream and unkempt man were reported." About 6 or 7 years ago, a man searching for his birth parents contacted park officials to explore the possibility that he might be Dennis Martin. Park spokesman Bob Miller said. Miller does not recall what made the man think he might be Dennis Martin, but after a quick comparison of the known facts of the man's life with those of Dennis Martin, Miller said, "We were able to put to rest his suspicions that he was Dennis Martin." The size and scope of the Martin search produced many lessons that led to improvements in future searches. It's the old adage of it being better to work smarter, not harder, Park Deputy Superintendent Kevin Fitzgerald said. "We learned that flooding an area with huge numbers of people is not the way to go in all cases, because you tend to lose some valuable clues and good tracking sign." Authorities also learned how to more efficiently manage searches. In 1972, in Utah, A loosely knit group of search and rescue workers formed a fledgling organization that became the National Association for Search and Rescue, NASAR, now recognized internationally as a leading conduit for exchanging information and developing new methods. Though it was not a direct outgrowth of the Dennis Martin case, lessons learned from the search for him quickly made their way into NASAR guidelines, McCarter says, and that has saved lives. Definitely, McCarter said.